Waverly, Ohio. March 1873. A carpenter walks into a newspaper office he helped build. He is 68 years old. His hands are the hands of a man who has spent his life measuring wood and cutting it true. He sits down across from a reporter and he begins to talk about his father. His father, he says, was Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the man who wrote in the summer of 1776 that all men are created equal, and who, at the moment he wrote it, owned more than 100 human beings. The carpenter's name is Madison Hemings. His mother was one of those human beings. Her name was Sally. He tells the reporter the whole of it. The bargain his mother struck in a foreign city when she was 16 years old. The promise she extracted from the most powerful man she would ever meet. The 4 children she carried out of slavery one by one without ever once carrying herself. And then the country does something with his testimony that it will keep doing for the next 125 years. It decides not to believe him. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Royal Aftermath. There is a version of American history that fits on a coin. The profile, the powdered hair, the steady gaze of a founder looking off toward posterity. We are very good at that version. We put it on our money, we carve it into stone, we teach it to children as a settled thing. And then there is the other version, the one that lived in the same house, cleaned over the same fires, laid out the same clothes each morning, and was never once asked to sit for a portrait. Tonight's story belongs to that second version. It is the story of a woman who left behind no letters we can read, no diary anyone has found, and not a single image drawn from life. 4 people described her in writing, and every one of those descriptions was written by somebody else. She spent her entire life inside one of the most documented households in the early republic, a house whose owner recorded the weather, the seed varieties, the daily temperature, and the exact market value of the people he owned. And she comes down to us as almost pure silence. But she was not silent in her own time. She made one decision, standing on free ground with a child already growing inside her, that shaped 4 lives, 2 centuries of argument, and the way an entire nation would eventually be forced to look at its founding. This is the story of what she asked for, what she gave up to get it, and what it cost her to be right. This is the story of Sally Hemings. To understand her, you have to go back before her, to the woman who gave her the name. Sometime in the 1730s, in the tidewater country of Virginia, an English sea captain fathered a child with an enslaved African woman. The woman had been carried across the ocean in a slave ship and sold into the household of a Virginia planter named John Wales. Under the law of the colony, her condition passed to her child the moment that child drew breath. So the daughter belonged to Wales before she had a name, before she had opened her eyes, before anyone had decided what to call her. The story that came down through the family is that the captain tried to buy her. He went to Wales and offered money for his own daughter, offered to purchase her and take her away and raise her free. Wales refused. The captain offered more. Wales refused again. And so, according to the account, the captain resolved to take the child by other means, and word of it reached the great house. And Wales pulled the mother and the infant inside where a sailor could not get to them. The captain sailed. He did not come back. The daughter he could not buy grew up as the property of the man who would not sell her. Her name was Elizabeth Hemings. Everyone called her Betty. Betty Hemings would live a long life inside that arrangement, and she would have 14 children. 6 of them were fathered by John Wales himself in the years after his 3rd wife died, a relationship that lasted the better part of a decade. Her grandson, writing many years later, reached for the only word the 19th century had given him for such a thing. He called it a concubinage. It was the word contemporaries used. It carried no dignity and no protection. A concubine had no legal standing, and her children could inherit nothing from their father. But it named the shape of the thing. The youngest of Betty's 6 children by John Wales was born around 1773. Her name may have been Sarah. From the beginning, they called her Sally. She was, by the arithmetic of that household, John Wales's daughter, which made her something else too, something the household knew and never spoke aloud. John Wales had another daughter, older, born to his first marriage, a free white woman raised as the mistress of the estate. Her name was Martha, and in 1772, Martha Wales married a rising young lawyer from the Virginia uplands, a tall red-haired man with a mountain and a library and enormous ambitions. His name was Thomas Jefferson. When John Wales died in 1773, his estate was divided among his heirs, the land, the crushing debt, and the people. And so an infant girl, not yet 2 years old, passed by inheritance into the household of Thomas Jefferson. Sit with the geometry of that for a moment. Sally Hemings and Martha Jefferson had the same father. They were half-sisters, one born free and white and the lady of the house, the other born enslaved and carried up a mountain as a toddler and entered in a ledger as property. They were, by blood, as close as two people can be. And that closeness had no bearing whatsoever on anything. In the world they were born into, it simply did not count. Nobody in that house pretended not to know. It just made no difference. The Hemings family occupied a particular place at Monticello, and it is important to be precise about what that place was, because it is easy to mistake it for kindness. They were not sent to the tobacco fields. They were kept close to the house and given the work that required trust: the cooking, the sewing, the care of the family's most intimate needs. Sally's mother, Betty, appears to have overseen the running of the household itself. Her brother Robert traveled with Jefferson. Her brother James would later be sent to France to be trained as a chef. Her brother Martin served as the butler. This was the family into which Sally was born, a family that lived in the house of the man who owned them, close enough to touch the people who held their futures in a drawer. It was not kindness. It was a system. Jefferson built his version of slavery as a kind of showpiece, and the people he trusted most were the people whose blood tied them, unspoken, to his own family. He kept them close. He gave them trades. And he never for one moment stopped owning them. Sally, from about the age of 6, was set to mind Jefferson's youngest daughters. That was the work of her childhood. Watch the children, fetch what was needed, stay close, stay quiet. There is no record of a school, no record of a lesson, no record of a single sentence she spoke as a girl. What we have instead are 4 descriptions written down long afterward by other people. The fullest came from a man named Isaac Granger, who had been enslaved at Monticello himself and worked in the blacksmith shop. Decades later, he remembered Sally Hemings as very near white, very handsome, with long, straight hair down her back. That is the most detailed portrait of her that exists anywhere in the world. A handful of words remembered by a blacksmith. There is nothing else. No painting, no sketch, no photograph. She died before the technology reached rural Virginia, the mother of a president's children. And we cannot tell you what her face looked like. In 1782, the woman at the center of that house began to die. Martha Jefferson, Sally's half-sister, though no document would ever put it that plainly, had endured pregnancy after pregnancy in 10 years of marriage and had buried most of the children. Her last delivery came in the spring. She never recovered. She lingered through the summer, and in September she died. She was 33 years old. Her husband broke. He shut himself in his room for weeks. When he finally came out, he rode the mountain roads alone for hours, until he could bear to be inside the walls again. Family tradition held that Martha, on her deathbed, asked him never to marry again, never to give her children a stepmother. Whatever passed between them, he kept that promise. Thomas Jefferson never remarried. Sally Hemings was about 9 years old when Martha died. She was somewhere in that grieving house. We know she was there. We do not know where she stood. 2 years. Later, Jefferson accepted a diplomatic post in Paris. He sailed for France, taking his oldest daughter and 1 enslaved man with him. He left the younger children behind in Virginia. He did not yet know it, but that decision to go to France and then to send for the rest of his household would put a 14-year-old enslaved girl on free soil at the exact moment she was old enough to understand what free soil meant. In 1787, Jefferson sent word back across the Atlantic. He wanted his youngest surviving daughter, Mary, the family called her Polly, brought to Paris to join him. The child was small and frightened and did not want to go. She needed someone to travel with her. An older enslaved woman had been intended for the crossing. Instead, the person who sailed with Polly was Sally Hemings. She was 14 years old. She crossed the ocean as a girl's companion and arrived in one of the great cities of the world. Paris changed the arithmetic of her life, and she was almost certainly aware that it had. France in those years had a legal principle that did not exist in Virginia. On French soil, slavery had no standing. An enslaved person who set foot in France and petitioned the courts could, in principle, be declared free. And there were cases where exactly that had happened. Jefferson knew this. He was the American minister. He understood the law of the country he was living in. He was quietly aware that every enslaved person in his Paris household was, technically, standing on ground where their bondage could dissolve. Sally spent roughly 2 years in that city. She was paid a wage there. Jefferson's own account books record it, the wage of a servant, small but real and hers. She was fitted for French clothes. She learned the language well enough, her son said later, to begin to feel at home in it. She lived, for the first and only time in her life, in a place where the law did not automatically define her as someone else's possession. And somewhere in those 2 years, the nature of her relationship to Thomas Jefferson changed. He was in his mid-40s, a widower, one of the most celebrated Americans alive. She was a teenager who belonged to him. Whatever we call what happened between them, and historians have argued for decades about what to call it. The plainest fact is the one that matters most for her story. There was no version of that relationship in which she could have said no and been safe. The power ran entirely in one direction. Her half-sister, the free white wife, had not been able to refuse this man's will either. Sally had far less standing than that. By 1789, Jefferson was preparing to return to Virginia, and Sally Hemings was pregnant. This is the hinge of the entire story. Because here is what her son said decades later in that Ohio newspaper office, and his account is the closest thing we have to her own voice. She did not want to go back. In France, she was free. In Virginia, she would be a slave again, and so would the child she was carrying. She understood this with total clarity. And so, a 16-year-old girl, pregnant, with nothing to bargain with except the one thing France had temporarily given her. She refused to board the ship. She named her terms. She would return to Virginia, she said, only if Jefferson made her a solemn promise, that the children she bore him would be set free, every one of them, freed when they came of age. Her son used the phrase that she implicitly relied on that pledge. Think about the position from which she negotiated. She had no lawyer, no property, no letters, no allies with power. She had her own body and the fact that, for the moment, she was standing where the law could not automatically drag her back. That was her entire leverage. And she spent it, all of it permanently, not on herself, but on children who had not yet been born. Jefferson agreed, and in the autumn of 1789, Sally Hemings boarded a ship home. They crossed the English Channel, then sailed from England aboard a vessel called the Clermont, and arrived back in Virginia just before Christmas. She walked back into slavery carrying an unborn child and an agreement that existed nowhere on paper, an agreement backed by nothing but the word of the man who owned her. She had traded a free life for a promise. Everything that followed would turn on whether that promise was kept. For the next 37 years, Sally Hemings lived at Monticello. And for most of that time, the historical record simply loses her. We know the shape of her days from a single sentence her son left behind. It was her duty, all through the years he could remember, to take care of Jefferson's chamber and his wardrobe, to look after the children, and to do light work such as sewing. That is the whole job description. She was the keeper of the most private spaces in the house of a man the world was watching. She bore at least 6 children. The first, born soon after the return from Paris, lived only a short time. Then came the others whose names survive in Jefferson's own careful records. A daughter named Harriet who died young, then a son called Beverly in 1798, then a second daughter, then a second Harriet in 1801, then Madison in 1805, then Eston in 1808. 4 of them lived to grow up. Here is one of the strange, telling details of this story. Thomas Jefferson kept what he called a farm book, a running ledger of his plantation, in which he recorded the births, names, and family lines of the people he owned, the way another man might record the increase of his livestock. Sally's children appear in it. Their births are noted in his hand, but the ledger never records what everyone in the house knew, who their father was. The most meticulous record keeper of his generation left that one fact blank. The silence was deliberate. It was the same silence the whole household kept. The silence broke once, loudly, in 1802. By then, Jefferson was President of the United States. And a journalist named James Callender a man who had once done Jefferson's political dirty work and felt he had not been paid what he was owed, turned on him in print. In a Richmond newspaper, Callender wrote that the president kept, and had for years kept, as his concubine one of his own slaves. Her name, he wrote, was Sally. The story tore across the country. Federalist newspapers reprinted it from Maine to Georgia. It was set to mocking verse. Opponents sneered about Dusky Sally. It was one of the ugliest personal scandals in the early history of the Republic. Jefferson never publicly answered it. He did not confirm it, and he did not deny it. He went about the business of being president, and the accusation followed him like a shadow for the rest of his life and long past his death. And in the middle of that national spectacle stood a woman who had no way to speak for herself, whose most intimate life was being argued over in newspapers she had never been taught to read, and whose name had become a punchline in a country she had helped to raise a president's children inside. She left no response. There was no channel through which she could have made one. She simply kept doing her duty in the private rooms of the man at the center of the storm. The promise, meanwhile, was still just a promise. It had been made in a foreign city 13 years earlier to a 16-year-old with no way to enforce it. Her oldest surviving children were still small. Whether the man would keep his word, whether the whole bargain had been real, or just the thing a powerful person says to end an inconvenient conversation, remained for 2 more decades an open question. The answer began to arrive in 1822. That year, Sally Hemings' 2 oldest surviving children reached the edge of adulthood. Beverly, the carpenter and fiddler, was in his early 20s. Harriet, who worked in the plantation's textile shop as a spinner and weaver, had turned 21. And they left. They walked off the mountain and out of slavery and into the rest of their lives. Jefferson did not stop them. In his records, he marked them quietly as runaways. But there was no pursuit, no advertisement, no reward posted. None of the machinery a Virginia planter would normally set in motion when property walked away. It was a fiction, and everyone involved understood it as a fiction. 2 young people were being allowed to disappear. The overseer of Monticello, a man named Edmund Bacon, remembered it plainly years afterward. He recalled putting Harriet on a stagecoach headed north and giving her $50 for the journey, money, he understood, that came from Jefferson himself. The daughter of the President of the United States rode away from her father's house with $50 in her hand and instructions to become someone new, because that is what Beverly and Harriet did. They were light-skinned enough to cross the line the country had drawn, and they crossed it. They went into white society, Beverly reportedly in Washington, and, according to their brother, they were never discovered. They married, they raised families who did not know or never said where they had come from. They erased the one fact that would have cost them everything. That was the price of the freedom their mother had bargained for. To be free, they had to stop being who they were. Then, in 1826, the last piece of the promise came due. And it came in the one form no one could argue with. Thomas Jefferson died on the 4th of July, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence. He died deep in debt, so deep that his estate could not survive him. But he had written a will, and in that will, out of the more than 100 people he owned at the end of his life, he set free exactly 5. Every one of them was a Hemings. Among them were Sally's 2 youngest sons, Madison and Eston, to be freed as they came of age, precisely as their mother had been promised in Paris 37 years before. Jefferson freed no other family whole, not one. Only the family bound to him by the blood no document ever named. So the promise was kept. All 4 surviving children of Sally Hemings became free, 2 allowed to walk away, 2 written into the will of a dying man. They were, historians have noted, the only enslaved family at Monticello, every one of whose members reached freedom. Every one of them, that is, except her. Read Jefferson's will, and you will not find Sally Hemings' name in it. The man had kept the promise he made about her children. He had not made one about her. She had asked for nothing for herself in Paris. The whole of her leverage had gone to the next generation. And so, at the end, there was no clause, no line, no legal instrument that made her free. What happened instead is one of the coldest passages in the whole record. When Jefferson died, his estate had to be settled and sold to pay what he owed. That meant an inventory. Appraisers walked through Monticello with a book, writing down everything the estate contained and assigning each item of value so the executors would know what they had to sell. Furniture, livestock, tools, books, people. Sally Hemings appears in that inventory. She is listed among the property. She was about 53 years old, and she had lived in that house since she was a toddler. And she had raised the man's children and kept his private rooms for the better part of 4 decades. Beside her name, the appraisers wrote a number, $50. The same figure the overseer had counted into her daughter Harriet's hand 4 years earlier to buy a seat on a coach and a new life. $50 had carried Harriet Hemings out of Virginia and into freedom. $50 was what the state of Virginia's appraisers decided her mother was worth. Standing in the wreckage of the estate, an old woman with no paper to her name. She was not sold. That much mercy the family extended. Jefferson's daughter Martha, his legitimate daughter, Sally's own niece by blood, the woman she had taken orders from for 30 years, quietly gave her what was called her time. It was not manumission. There was no document filed at the courthouse, no formal grant of freedom. It was simply an understanding. No one would claim her, no one would come after her, no one would put her in a sale lot. She could go and live and be let alone. It was freedom without the piece of paper, which, in Virginia at that time, mattered enormously because the law required freed people to leave the state within a year. And a woman with no papers and no proof could stay quiet in Charlottesville in a way a legally freed woman could not. The absence of the document was, in a bitter way, what let her remain near what was left of her family. So Sally Hemings walked down the mountain and never went back. Her 2 youngest sons, Madison and Eston, rented a house in Charlottesville, and she went to live with them. She was in her 50s, then her 60s. She had no owner and no papers and no idea where her 2 oldest children had vanished to in the white world they had disappeared into. And here, right at the end, the silence breaks for a single sentence. The only sentence she is known to have spoken about her own life. The census taker came through in 1830 and wrote the household down as free white people. Then, 3 years later, after Virginia grew nervous following Nat Turner's rebellion and took a special census of its free black population, someone asked Sally Hemings directly to account for herself, and she answered. She said she was a free woman of color and that she had lived in Charlottesville since 1826. That is it. Where she lived, since when, given to a clerk with a ledger. In a life of more than 60 years, it is the one moment the record lets us hear her speak, and what she chose to say was, in effect, I am free, and I have been since the year he died. She died in 1835. She was about 62 years old. Her sons were with her. No one wrote down where they buried her. The location of her grave is unknown. It has been searched for. It has not been found. There is no stone anywhere that you can stand in front of and say, here she is. She had won everything she asked for. Every single term of the bargain she made as a pregnant 16-year-old on the free soil of Paris had come true. 4 children, all free, and the one thing she never asked for and never got was a document with her own name on it saying that she belonged to herself. Which brings us back to a print shop in Waverly, Ohio, and a carpenter with true hands. In 1873, Sally Hemings' son Madison sat down and told the whole story to a newspaper. He named his father. He described the bargain in Paris, the promise, the children freed one by one. He was fair to Jefferson where he could be. He said the man was quiet at home, rarely angry, kind to those around him. And then he set down, without heat, the observation that cuts deepest of all, that Jefferson was affectionate toward his white grandchildren, but was not in the habit of showing that kind of fatherly warmth toward the children he had with Sally. Madison had watched both things happen in the same rooms for years. He simply recorded them. He gave the reporter his address, he went back to his carpentry, and the country filed his testimony under things that could be safely ignored. For the next 125 years, that is exactly what happened to it. Historians who had built entire careers on Thomas Jefferson explained that the memory of a formerly enslaved man was not evidence. The Hemings family's own oral history, carried carefully across 4 generations in Ohio and Wisconsin and beyond, passed from parent to child with the specific knowledge of who they were descended from, was dismissed as folklore. It was hearsay. It was, in the phrase of the era, just what those people claimed. The word of a founder's white descendants outweighed the word of his black ones every time for a century and a quarter. And then, in November of 1998, the argument met something it could not talk its way around. A team of geneticists led by Dr. Eugene Foster published a study in the scientific journal Nature. The headline was blunt: Jefferson fathered slave's last child. The researchers had compared the Y chromosome, the genetic signature passed almost unchanged from father to son, of male line descendants of the Jefferson family against a male line descendant of Sally's youngest son, Eston. They matched. The Jefferson Y chromosome signature was rare, carried by well under 1% of the population, and it was there in Eston Hemings' line exactly where a century of oral history had always said it would be. The study also demolished the alternative that Jefferson's defenders had offered for generations, the theory that some other relative, a nephew, had fathered Sally's children. The genetics ruled the nephews out. The authors wrote that the simplest and most probable explanation for what they had found was that Thomas Jefferson himself was Eston's father. Now, historians are careful people, and it is worth being careful here too. The DNA alone pointed to a Jefferson man, and there were other Jefferson males in Virginia who carried the same signature. But the genetics did not stand alone. They landed on top of a mountain of other evidence. Madison's account, the timing of Jefferson's presence at Monticello for each of Sally's conceptions, the contemporary rumors, the pattern of privileges given to this one family, the freedom granted to this one family, and no other. Taken all together, the case became, for most scholars, overwhelming. In the year 2000, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, the organization that owns and operates Monticello and that had spent most of the 20th century insisting the story was a myth, completed its own review of the evidence and reversed itself. It concluded that Thomas Jefferson was, in all likelihood, the father of all of Sally Hemings' children. Since 2018, the Foundation has simply treated it as a fact. And then Monticello did something you can go and see. For most of the 20th century, there had been a small room in the south wing of the mansion, windowless, below ground level, about 14 feet wide, built to Jefferson's own design in 1809, a short walk from his own bedroom. In 1941, the people responsible for preserving Jefferson's house had taken that room, laid tile over its brick floor, put up partitions, and turned it into a men's public restroom. For the better part of 80 years, visitors relieved themselves in a space historians came to believe had been the living quarters of Sally Hemings. In 2017, archaeologists pulled up the tile. They found the original hearth where a fire had once burned, a surviving row of the old brick floor, the traces of the room as it had been. And in 2018, Monticello opened that space to the public as an exhibition about the life of Sally Hemings. The first time in the history of the estate that her existence was given a room of its own, at the center of the house, in the light. On a June day that year, the descendants of Sally Hemings and the descendants of Thomas Jefferson came to Monticello together and stood in that house as one family to mark it. The carpenter in Ohio had been telling the truth the whole time. It only took the country 145 years to build a room around it. So let us close where these stories always close, with the ledger. Because Sally Hemings lived and died inside ledgers, and it is worth totaling them up honestly. On one side of the account, no portrait, and there never was one. No letter in her hand, and there never was one. No grave anyone can point to, and there may never be one. 4 descriptions, all written by other people. 1 sentence to a census clerk. A blank space where a meticulous man declined to write down that he was a father. And a final valuation. In the wreckage of an estate that priced a 53-year-old woman who had given her life to that house at $50. That is what the record did to her. That is what the people with the pens decided she was worth. And on the other side of the account, there is this. 4 children who walked off that mountain free. 2 of them into new lives in the white world. 2 of them written into the will of a dying president. all of them free from the thing their mother had known, and their grandmother had known, and their great-grandmother had known, the dread of belonging, body, and children and future to someone else. A 16-year-old girl standing on free ground in Paris with a child inside her and nothing to trade but her own liberty, spent every bit of it, permanently and on purpose, to buy that freedom for people who did not yet exist. She never got the paper with her own name on it, but she got the thing she actually asked for, every term of it, and it held. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, and that sentence outlived him and became the promise the country keeps trying to grow into. But there was a woman in his own house who made a promise of her own, smaller, quieter, unwritten, enforced by nothing but the corner she had backed a powerful man into, and she kept hers to the letter and made him keep his. We remember the man who wrote the famous sentence, "His face is on the money in your pocket, his house is on the mountain." Her name was Sally Hemings. She had no grave and no portrait and no paper of her own, and 4 free people walked down that mountain because of exactly one thing she did. That is the largest thing anyone ever carried out of Monticello. And it cannot be photographed, and it is not in any collection, and it belonged to a woman the ledger valued at $50. Thank you for watching Royal Aftermath. If this story moved you, stay with us. There are more of them, waiting in the rooms history walked past.